Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
I even love the smell of books. Hi, welcome to Sundaku, the podcast for anyone who feels like life just isn't complete unless you have a book on the go. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Kath Keneally.
And Kath, can you believe it's coming up Booker Prize time again? It seems to come around very quickly.
Yeah, I cannot keep up. I have to say, I just wait until I see a book in the library that says Booker shortlisted on it, and I think, okay, I'll start there.
Right, well, we've got the shortlist.
Well, apparently none of the 6 authors has previously been shortlisted for the prize, so that's interesting. There's 1 Brit, there's 1 Canadian, 2 Irish and 2 American authors, and the books seem to be addressing many of the most pressing concerns of the moment: climate change, immigration, financial hardship, persecution of minorities, political extremism, and the erosion of personal freedoms.
Well, it sounds a bit dark, doesn't it? I hope there's some lighter.
Dark.
The one that I've been hearing about is Paul Murray, and he's an Irish author. I think he's only written 1 book before. It's called The Bee Sting, and it's about a pretty dysfunctional but rather amusingly so family. But The Guardian said you won't find a sadder, truer, funnier book than this. I kind of like the sound of that.
I
Give
like
it a
the
go.
sound of that. At least it's got funny in it. Okay, so a bit of reading to do there. But what we have for you right now in this episode 33 of Sundaku is a couple of freshly published authors, both from the west of Australia.
Western Australia, really producing a lot of writing. Last week, Natasha Lester was on a book tour. Now, she's done 8 books. She does an awful lot of research for them. She's a New York Times best-selling author, and her latest book is called The Disappearance of Astrid Bricard. It's a wide-ranging saga about fashion, feminism and war.
I like the sound of that. And later I will be talking to the multi-talented Dave Warner, muso, writer, filmmaker, and just about anything else about his new book, Summer of Blood.
And now let's talk to Natasha Lester about her new novel, The Disappearance of Astrid Bricard. It's a 3-generation saga based in the high fashion world, and it moves backwards and forwards between wartime Paris, 1970s New York, and the present day. In the early days of haute couture, Mitzah Bricard is recognised as the muse of Christian Dior, but not for her fashion skills and acumen, but for her habit of not wearing underwear. Decades later, her daughter Astrid is a designer in New York, and she's about to launch a collection in memory of her mother when she disappears under a cloud. And in the current day, Astrid's abandoned daughter, Blythe Bricard, is trying to avoid the fashion world that seems to remember her mother and grandmother only as disgraced women. The novel begins with a shocking moment as Astrid's collection is about to be unveiled at a high fashion event in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Here's Natasha Lester reading from the opening scene.
Why the hell is the centrepiece of Astrid's collection lying sprawled on the floor of the Hall of Mirrors? Hawk's feet move him forward. He's halfway across the vast, glittering hall before anyone else notices the bundle. He's 3/4 of the way across when he sees that a crimson sash of savage red now stains the silk. If the red staining Astrid's gown is blood, then he knows that means Astrid is dead or gone. And so too is he.
I asked Natasha to explain Astrid and Hawk's story.
So Astrid is the daughter of Christian Dior's infamous so-called muse, Mitzah Bricard, and she comes to Manhattan in 1970 determined to become a fashion designer, not a muse like her mother. She does find fame pretty quickly, but just not for the things she'd hoped to become famous for. And as part of that, she meets a man called Hawk Jones, and with him they design together, or perhaps he designs it, it's not quite clear at the start, a famous silver lame dress that has a photograph taken of it, and it becomes a very iconic 1970s moment. And from then on, Astrid's path seems to be set, and it's not necessarily in the direction that she wants it to be heading in.
And she does disappear pretty fast. We won't talk about what may happen later in the book. There's a lot of twists and turns. Let's go to the first generation, which is Mitzah, the legend of the mother that left her daughter. She's remembered for her sexiness and being a muse to Christian Dior. She's based on a real historical figure. Can you tell us about her and why you were drawn to that story?
So I've been wanting to write about Mitzah since about 2019 when I was researching another one of my books, The Paris Secret. And in every non-fiction account about Christian Dior that I had read, Mitzah was mentioned, and the descriptions of Mitzah were along the lines of a woman who never wore her underwear, who swanned around in only a fur coat with all of these jewels that had been lavished upon her by all the many, many men she had slept with, and that she was probably demi-horizontale, which is a famous fancy French word for lady of the night. And so I kind of believed all of those descriptions because they were in non-fiction books, so they were supposed to be fact. And it wasn't until I began doing some research of my own into Mitzah that I discovered there was so much more to the story of Mitzah Bricard. And she was an incredible woman, actually the first assistant designer to Christian Dior, and it should have been her name in the back of those gowns and on the awning above the shop alongside his, rather than somehow being demoted to this very inferior position of muse by history.
In your book, she isn't just a muse, and as some would have had actually a whore, you know, the whole idea of sexiness not going with any other kind of quality. And she plays a brave role in the war. How much evidence did you have to create that role for her?
I had a lot of evidence about the fact that she was actually considered within the fashion industry at the time to be a greater designer than Coco Chanel, which is a direct quote from her obituary. But I didn't have that much evidence about what she did during those war years. It's the one missing space, the empty gap in her life history. But I knew that she had been friends with so many French resistance. For example, she lived in the same apartment building as the man who coordinated all of the resistance activities in her area. She had worked for Molyneux until he fled back to England as the Germans occupied Paris. And two of the other men she worked with at Molyneux were famous SOE operators, so they were spies for the Allied cause. She made hats for the man who kind of led the kind of charge against the Germans in Paris. His wife she made hats for. So she just seemed to have so many connections to people who were fighting for the French resistance and for the Allies. I thought, I don't believe Mitzah just sat in her apartment bedecked in jewels and did nothing during the war. So I decided to create a storyline for her.
And it's always a dangerous thing to do though, isn't it? Connecting the dots. Do you have any comeback? I mean, she's a real person. Does she have family? Has anybody ever come back to you and challenged that?
I don't think they would challenge it, because what I'm doing for the large part of the story is showing how remarkable she actually was and how she's been so poorly treated by the years. And also she never had any children, so she really doesn't have any direct descendants, which I think is actually pretty sad. So her line is dead. There aren't too many people left to really care what happens to her name, I suppose, which is perhaps why she's been able to become just the muse rather than the creative designer that she was.
But in your book, she does have a child, and that child has a child. So there we have the three women, the three generations. Blythe Bricard is the youngest. Tell me about her.
So Blythe Bricard is kind of cursed by the Bricard name. Her grandmother and her mother were apparently both muses for famous fashion designers, and Blythe has been struggling with that legacy since she understood that she carried this legacy with her. And so she also has two children who are the centre of her life and who she's trying to protect from the kind of media scrutiny that she grew up with based on her famous parents.
And a lot of it goes back to the silver dress picture. Tell me about that.
So there is a photograph taken of Astrid dancing on a podium at a nightclub in Manhattan, an actual nightclub that existed back then. And the skirt is very short of that dress. And as Hawk falls forward to protect himself, he reaches out a hand and it kind of grazes her ass. And at that exact moment, a photographer snaps a picture. And the picture appears to tell a story quite different to what actually happened on the night.
But it's like a curse that goes on through the years. Astrid's missing. Blythe is there with this assumption that her mother was, a drug addict actually, and sort of fallen woman.
Yes, what really inspired me to write that part of the story was kept seeing so many headlines about so many famous women who were actually at the height of their careers, were earning a lot of money, were very inspiring women, and somehow in media headlines and they were reduced to something much less than what they were, and accompanying those headlines was always the one photo that seemed to support what the headline was saying, when in fact there were 1,000 other photos that supported an entirely different and far more accurate story. And I was really intrigued by the way that the media can really hone in on this one photo, and through the power of the media, that photo can become the story that is emblematic of a person's life, even though it may not necessarily be true at all.
You gave a great list of photos like that, male and female. Are you able to run through those? Do you remember them? Jennifer Aniston was one, I remember.
Yes, that's right. Jennifer Aniston, there are so many headlines of her being, shattered and jilted and obsessed once she broke up with Brad. Taylor Swift, for example, various headlines saying that, she's coming for your daughters, or people went to high school with Taylor and they hated her, or those really famous ones of Taylor with a flat stomach and an arrow pointing to her flat stomach saying pregnant and who's the dad? Because of course Taylor would have no idea who the dad actually would be of her child, according to the media. And my favourite is one about Meghan Markle and how her flowers on her wedding day may have put Princess Charlotte's life at risk, as if she was carrying a pistol in her bouquet of flowers or something like that.
And you compare those pictures with iconic male pictures.
Yes, and you look at photographs and headlines about men, and always in those headlines it's possible to tell what the man actually does for a living, what he's famous for, whereas with the women it's never possible to tell that Taylor Swift is the biggest selling female artist of all time. She's just simply the woman who falls pregnant and has no idea who the father is.
So your book is having a pretty good go at the male domination of the fashion industry.
Yeah, I was really sort of enraged, I guess, to learn that the editor of Women's Wear Daily, which was the seminal trade publication of the time, was this horrendous man who would make these arbitrary rules when it came to the women in the industry and would make life so difficult for them. He banned a woman named Pauline Trigère from ever being mentioned in his magazine, and she was a fashion designer. So if you're a fashion designer and the editor has banned your name from the pages of the magazine, how are you ever going to not be known for what you do, and how are you ever going to get recognition within that industry? And his name was John Fairchild, and he declared that no women should ever wear trousers. So if you were a female fashion designer designing trousers for women, you were on his off list, and that women should never be photographed, and that he would hate for anyone to photograph his wife because she was a treasure that only he should own. And so once again, photographing women is such a key part of the fashion industry. You can see how all of these things meant that the men retained the power in fashion throughout the 1970s, and the women were shunned.
Yeah, it seemed to me, and I had just finished reading Wifedom by Anna Funder, and it just seemed, again, like you were retrieving these women's stories from history and retelling them.
Yeah, and I kept saying it's a sad fact that I'll probably be able to keep writing historical fiction for years, because there are so many women who have been treated like this by history that I will never run out of stories. But that's actually a terrible thing. I shouldn't have to have so many women that I could write about that I feel like I can keep writing about them. I'd like to kind of reach a point where every woman who ever did something remarkable in history has had her story told properly and has received justice and accolades for that. But I don't think that I ever will.
It must have been a lovely detective trail, though, finding those little scraps of history, those letters, the little clues that give another story.
Yeah, it was. It was really exciting, actually. It was the first time where I felt like the research I was doing was uncovering something brand new, a story that had never been told. And those documents that I found that let me piece together Mitzah's true story were not actually that hard to find, and it really made me wonder how lazy these non-fiction writers were to have not done the work to find them, but to repeat the same story that had been told over and over again. I had letters from famous fashion photographer Cecil Beaton declaring how brilliant Mitzah was, a Sydney Morning Herald newspaper article stating in black and white that she was Dior's first assistant designer. Her obituary, as I've said before, was very easy to find, and declares that she was a better designer than Coco Chanel. And if me, an amateur researcher with only access to a limited number of databases, not like what a journalist would have access to, can find those things, then shame on the journalist for not doing the work.
Why the interest in Christian Dior? Because this is not the first book where he has appeared.
No, it's not. I think because he so influenced fashion. I mean, before Dior, Chanel absolutely influenced fashion, and then Dior came along in 1947, and his new look really changed the way women dressed for a very long time thereafter. And I'm always fascinated by people who have such an influence on women's lives and their daily lives, in fact. And, you know, we all wear clothes every day, and so when women are choosing what to wear, the people who make those designs are the ones who are very powerful, in fact, and we don't really always consider that. And also, he did have these amazing women working around him, these 4 women in particular, who were the heads of his studio, his ateliers, his sales department, and Mitzah the muse. And I think all of them are equally as fascinating and equally worthy of being spoken about. So I keep being drawn back to him for those reasons, and also because his sister Catherine Dior was such an incredible heroine for the French resistance. So I wrote about her in an earlier book as well.
And it's a fascinating time that he lived in, you know, which has other books than this one deal with the Second World War and what was actually going on in France.
Yes, and also that immediate post-war period where Dior became famous, where you have all these women who had been doing extraordinary, remarkable, independent things during the war, and who had suddenly found that with all the men returning, they were being told their skills were no longer required, and that actually their role was to go back home, make chicken dinners for their returned husbands, brothers, fathers, etc. And that was all the world wanted from them. And I always just think, wow, how must that have felt to have been literally had all your future options taken away from you when you knew you were capable of doing so much more. And so that's also something I find really interesting to interrogate about that post-war Christian Dior new look period.
Another part of the war story that really struck me was when the resistance, towards the end, when victory was in sight and a lot of people decided that they were with the resistance, they finally started to get brave when they didn't have to be brave anymore. And that was a horrendous thing for so many women who'd held it together during the war. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so a lot of the men in France had been sent to prisoner of war camps, which was a terrible experience, but it meant that largely in the homes and on the streets were women. And families all moved in together because they could pull their ration coupons. There was no coal to heat multiple houses or apartments, so they only had enough to heat one space. And so you had mothers living with their own mothers and their cousins and their nieces and their children, these large families, and they had to feed everybody. And there was never any food left in the shops, even if you had ration coupons. And so from time to time, you had to make compromises. You had to choose, do I smile at this German soldier, or do I not smile at him and risk him arresting me and therefore having no way to feed the 15 people who are relying on me to be able to keep going to the market to get whatever food that I can find? And at the end of the war, many people decided that the women who had done those things were collaborators who had supported and worked with the Nazis, when in fact those women were just trying their best to get through every day. And, you know, it really made me wonder, was the world that they fought for during the war worth their sacrifice? I don't know that in many cases that it was, as the French forces of the interior shaved those women's heads, they paraded them through the streets, hung signs around them proclaiming them collaborators, tore their clothes off them, and many of those women were killed. And it was, and people say that in some ways the rage that was enacted upon these women was a saving grace, because it meant that less people were kind of killed in the after-war violence, because the crowd had an object to kind of vent their anger upon. But I think, how terrible is that? That's not a justification for what happened.
No, and for women, just hearing that sort of thing now, so many years later, that actually did happen.
Yeah.
And realising how we take the rap for so many things.
Yes, oh, absolutely. And particularly when there are documented stories that many of those men who were marching those women through the streets had been collaborators themselves, and it only turned in the couple of weeks before it became apparent that the Allies were going to win. And and they should have been the ones being marched and paraded, not the women.
So amazing conversation we're having, considering I thought this book was going to be about fashion. It's a complex novel, obviously. We've gone into all those stories, and enormous amount of research, obviously, happening. You have 3 small children, I believe. How do you do it? Are you an incredibly organised person? You've produced, 8 historical novels in the time that you've had small children. So how organised are you?
I always joke that I love a list. I'm a very organised person in every area of my life, and I have to be. My kids are actually now in their teens, so they're a little easier than they were when I first began writing, but it is a constant juggle, and I'm very lucky that over the last sort of 3 years or so, my husband has really stepped up and become the kind of person who I can go away on book tour for 2 weeks like I am right now, and I can walk away knowing that he will be absolutely all over the kids' activities. It probably won't get done quite the same way that I would do it, but it will get done. They'll all get to where they need to be on time and most likely in the right clothes, and that's a win as far as I'm concerned. For me, it's always about thinking quite a long way ahead and trying my best to deliver manuscripts early rather than on time, and definitely never late, because you just never know when one of your kids is going to fall ill and end up in hospital and you're going to lose a week because you need to be there with your kid because they're feeling really unwell. So for me, it's always about working ahead and making sure that if the deadline is October, that for me, that deadline means September.
I know you had a lot of rejections in the early days, like most authors can relate to. It must feel great now. You must feel like you're surfing a wave.
Yeah, I do. I always say that writing is a roller coaster, and through every writer's career, there will be moments when your roller coaster is at the bottom of the hill and it looks like it's never going to get its way back up to the top, but it always does. So long as you hang in there and you keep writing, the worst thing to do is to think, oh, I'm not having any luck, I'll stop now, because you never know when that luck is around the corner. And there've been a couple of very lucky moments that I've had in my life, and I think that if you aren't continuing to work hard, you won't be there when the luck is ready to find you.
Author Natasha Lester talking to Sundoku about her latest book, The Disappearance of Astrid Bricard.
This is Sundoku, the podcast for people who can't go past the written word in any form. So now to Dave Warner, who many of us might remember from his band Dave Warner's from the Suburbs in the late 60s and through the 70s and 80s. I think it might still be going. He has written another in his very entertaining series featuring detectives from the 60s. And in Summer of Blood, he sends them off to California in search of a missing lad. And along the way, they meet anyone you would care to name from the music scene that was taking off in 1967. Janis Joplin,
He's
Frank
having a
Zappa.
great time with history.
He is having a fabulous time with history, with actual history and his own history. He wanted to write a book that was a tribute to what was happening for him in 1967, and we started off our conversation by comparing notes on our own experiences of that time. It's 1967, you were being chased around classrooms by deranged Christian brothers, and I was being instructed by Dominican sisters. But meanwhile, all around us was the breakout of revolution in music and behaviour and mind expanding and tuning in and dropping out. And this is your tribute to the music and the times, using your detectives Ray and John as your vehicles. And so you have to find a fictional excuse to send them in as riders on the storm to where the action is. What do you cook up?
Yeah, and they appeared, first of all, in a book of mine called Big Bad Blood. And like you said, Kath, it is a labour of love. One, because I really loved that book, which was the second one that I wrote. It was set in King's Cross in 1965. But also, as you say, I always sort of had this idea, I would have loved to have been, part of the Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco 1967. And so I thought, how can I get those two together? And I had the idea that the son of a kind of important businessman and political contact of the police minister drops out of Berkeley Uni in California and goes missing, and the local cops in America can't find him, and so John Gordon and Ray Shearer, my two cops, get sent on this kind of private detective mission, if you like, to try and find him and bring him back, and that was the starting point. The other thing that I liked about that was not only it gave me an excuse to put them there, but because, you know, cops from Australia in 1967, this would have been a completely different world for them. And it's always great, I think, when you put characters out of their comfort zone and throw them into something that they're not sure about. And so, I have them go off on what to start out with seems like a reasonably straightforward investigation and then becomes more complex as time goes on.
It sure does. And you start taking enormous liberties with the biographies of famous people pretty early on.
I did. In particular, Janis Joplin comes in and she ends up surprisingly getting on extremely well with Ray Shearer, who is the last person in a way that you'd think a hippie person might get on with, because Ray is very much a kind of teddy boy, Johnny O'Keefe type of guy, but he has his own version of morality, and I think he actually would click with Janis if they got the chance. So I put them in the same situation, and at that time, you know, San Francisco wasn't such a huge city, so the chances were, if you were mingling at these places, and every event except one that I have in the book was a real event that happened. So if I had Country Joe and the Fish playing at the Fillmore with Janis Joplin supporting them, that's an actual gig that happened on, you know, the 17th of March 1967 or whenever it might have been. So once I got my people there, I just had to cross paths and let the sparks fly.
And it really is a dizzying ride in the sense of being a road trip first and foremost, isn't it? They're herring around all over the place. Where do you take them?
Yeah, so they start in San Francisco, exactly as you say, and they're going around the locale there, and their investigations lead them to understand that the missing guy has got this hippie girlfriend, Spring, who's disappeared and seems to have gone to Los Angeles. And they think, well, if she's in Los Angeles, everybody thinks that he's gone to look for her there. So they're primarily ping-ponging between San Francisco and Los Angeles and the various counties of LA, and that's really where the story's set. And at one point they split up, and one's in San Francisco and one's in Los Angeles at the same time. In time where you walk into a bar and there's the Doors playing, or Love, or Eric Burden, Frank Zappa.
It was a real delight just to nod your recognition of all of the famous names of band after band. Made you want to run off and dig out the old vinyl. But I guess there was a list of dead set faves that you were determined to get in by hook or by crook. Who were they?
My absolute favourites of that time as a schoolboy student, Country Joe and the Fish were very high. Frank Zappa was very high. Janis and the Doors, you know, I listened to all of those kind of albums and other more obscure ones, but all of those artists in particular. And so I was very keen to have Janis there, one, because she's just such a larger-than-life figure, and I think she would have been great fun. I think she would have got on well with my Aussie cops, you know, she does in my imagined my reinvention of 1967. I
think she might have been happy enough with the way you brought it to life, really. It rang true to me.
You try and bring whatever humanity the characters can give one another, and I think she has a quite profound effect on Ray, and he's left hoping at the end of the book that he might have had some sort of effect on her too.
The pace is pretty fast and furious. You don't have a lot of time to stop and think about what's making the defining events of that time happen, except that you do, I think Ray or John meets an academic at some point who has a little bit of a think about why it's all happening at that time and in that place.
John, it's something that John, who's the younger of the cops, feels intuitively. He kind of understands that the people on the streets in San Francisco feel that they are part of something that's bigger and something that's universal, and it is this wave of youth, the post-war baby boomers, actually having a power to change things around them. And he gets to chat with a filmmaker who I made, a British filmmaker who'd gone out to shoot some documentaries on the anti-war marches, morphed into something much bigger than that, which was whole questions of lifestyle and what sort of lifestyle we should pursue. In retrospect, raises questions of what happened to all of that in the intervening years, although in the last 3 or 4 years we now have this kind of rebirth of activism. It's almost like all of those hippie mantras that have come home to roost 45 years later. But my mate Greg McCain from Skyhooks wrote that great song, Whatever Happened to the Revolution, in the 1970s. You know, most people ascribe to kind of being wiped out in the 1968 Democratic Convention and, you know, and the violence on the streets and a divided America and stuff kind of, you know, undercut and destroyed a lot of the foundations of that. But, you know, I'm only watching from afar as a consumer of pop art, really. So I'm not qualified to make any judgments other than what works for my characters in the story and how they feel about things.
So Martin is missing because he's on the trail of a serial killer, as it turns out. His girlfriend's disappeared. He thinks she might have been another victim. That had the feel of possibly something that was really happening or had happened around then?
I don't know that there were like girls or people, you know, being abducted or going missing between the cities, but it kind of stands to reason that in a place like America, and I think that was one of the points I was making, that the cops and everyone just wrote it off and said, well, look, these people have dropped out and they're hitchhiking daily from San Francisco to LA. So if there was a killer on the road, as the Doors sang, and they removed somebody and killed you and dumped you in the desert, I mean, who would know, really? You know, it was the thought was, oh, they've just moved on to somewhere else and they've now gone to Oregon or Alaska or something. And so I wasn't following any real case or particular thing there, other than at the very end of my case, I wanted to, you know, being an Aussie, I wanted to have a crack at one of the great American unsolved cases, probably, you know, one of the most iconic cases in crime history, and I thought my cops should solve it, which they kind of do, but they can never tell anybody about it. So, but I won't do a spoiler. But
Dave, I have to say, when I opened up and started reading, I thought this is going to be very much a bloke's book. It'll be blood and thunder and chicks and hard liquor, and I think one of the reasons I enjoyed it was because you make John Gordon a bit more malleable than old Ray Shearer, who's a bit of a dinosaur. Can you tell us about his backstory and what changes he undergoes in the story?
Yes, well, John Gordon in the first story, Big Bad Blood, where they meet Ray as kind of his mentor, and he's a corrupt cop working for a King's Cross person. But as I say, he kind of has his own morality. He's corrupt in one way, but he's not super bad. But he is very much your traditional Australian bloke of the late 1950s, early 1960s. And John Gordon, on the other hand, was kind of my era. He had just graduated from the police college. And what happened in the first book, you don't have to know this I don't think for the enjoyment of Summer of Blood, but what happened in that is that there was quite an involved serial killer, and John Gordon in the end was abducted with his girlfriend at the time and nearly killed. And so when we pick him up in 1967 he's still suffering from this trauma, it's like a PTSD, and he's wondering if he will ever get over that, and the only way he generally can get over it is when he's with his now wife, and so he's he's susceptible, but he's also very open, and because he's young, he is full of ideas, and he is of a different generation to the police around him and the authorities that he deals with. And so for him, he's quite able to mix in the circles of the hippies and drop a tab of acid, and he's vulnerable, I guess, is the thing. He's a very vulnerable person, and both John and Ray are noble. They're noble men, but doesn't mean to say you're going to like them or what they do all the time, and particularly Ray, as you say, because he is very much Like I know when my wife's reading the book, she goes, "Oh, that, Ray," because his idea is, well, even though he's got a woman at home in Australia, he's never going to get this opportunity to be anywhere else again. So he has a different philosophy. But on the other hand, Ray is the person who steps in when the guys hassle Janis Joplin. Ray's the one who steps in and says, "That's enough of that," that you don't speak to a woman like that. And so he has his noble moments. But I think, John, I related to, because that was my era, and you're growing up and experiencing all those sorts of things around you, and trying to find your way. As he was. He's probably slightly older than what I was, but not much. And look, I'm glad you related to it. I try and with all my books, make them I generally write from a male point of view, but I try and have major female characters and also make it very relatable for women. But I mean, there's so many fabulous female crime writers. I don't try and get into their territory too much.
No, I liked all the women. And there's such a cast of them. It's a really intricate story. We're meeting one person after another, but the female characters rang very true. Do you think, finally, Dave, it's a story for a certain generation? It certainly is, but for our generation only, or will the young folks of today like it?
Oh, look, I would think that the story would translate to any generation. There's certain things that people of our generation get. There's certain little points where you look at it, or nostalgic moments, or just moments where you go, "Oh God," that trying to go overseas. I was trying to think back in my time, and I remember people would send a telegram and say things like telegrams, which was short, and you had to go into the post office and pay money to do a short telegram, was how people communicated overseas, because just the chances of ringing someone from overseas was so hard. And then if you ever did get through on those occasional times, the delay on those undersea cables was so long, no one could ever talk at the same time, So it was those kind of little things, I think, that people of our generation would get, but just in terms of the story and in terms of the characters, and hopefully it's, as you say, hopefully it's exciting and a really pacey read. So I hope anybody of any generation would enjoy it. But maybe there's a little, cherry on top for those of us who can remember Woodstock.
Dave Warner, and the book is Summer of Blood from Fremantle Press.
This is Sundaku, the program for anyone who has a pile of books next to their bed that they're planning to read sometime.
Hi, I'm Lee, and I have a sizable Sunduko because for the past 3 decades, since I was in my 20s, I discovered that buying books has nothing to do with reading them, and therefore the Sunduko is extensive. One of the memorable moments in my book acquiring journey was I joined a book club for 10 years at a really pivotal time when I was having my first child. And I really wanted to avoid being the stereotypical mum with mummy brain, going to coffee dates and just living life in this haze. And so for that book club, I chose Ulysses by James Joyce, and I thought I should really challenge us. And they were such bright-minded women, and I was so impressed by them. And honestly, with that book, we just could not even make sense of the style at all. It was not a good experience for us. These days I journal a lot every day, and I have kind of always dreamed of learning about creative writing. And recently I read Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, and the first page grabbed me at a really deep visceral level. And when I read about Delia Owens, the author, I was so impressed by her move from technical scientific writing to creative writing, and how she wove such deep cultural and gender issues into a wonderfully written and really popular story. And that made such an impression on me to really pursue writing, because I think it can make such an impact on people's lives. I'm a philosophy geek and I read a bit about Stoicism. A favourite joyful Stoic of mine is the late Queen Elizabeth, Her Royal Highness, who requires no introduction. And what I read was Long Live the Queen, 23 Rules for Living from Britain's Longest Reigning Monarch by Brian Kozlowski. And it was really interesting to just go behind the scenes on so many aspects of things that she has said versus what those around her have said, and her approach during so many difficult times in her career, which is how she lived through her career. And I'm also reading A Mind at Home with Itself, which is by Byron Katie with Stephen Mitchell. And it weaves Buddhist philosophy with this highly accomplished therapeutic process creator Byron Katie's method of self-inquiry. And that has been a ridiculously simple book, and I've enjoyed that so much.
And we'd love to hear from you. If you're keen to share your reading habits and your reading past, or give us a review of a book you've just read, and give us a glimpse of your sundoku, that pile by your bed, send us a voice memo to sundokukast@gmail.com.
Thanks for joining us today. I'm Kath Keneally.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. Catch you next time.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Sarah Martin,
Annie Hastwell,
Michaela Andreev,
And me, Kath Keneally. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to find out more about the books and authors featured in this program, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokUcast, which is TSUNDOKU cast.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.